Hi.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, Anna.
People are joining us, so we're just letting them, and hello everybody that's watching. People are joining us, so we're not going to start until we're confident that pretty much everybody who's subscribed to this is actually with us and listening and watching. Is that all right with you, Claire?
Of course it is. I think we're nearly up to the 200, so maybe we can...
If you're happy to start,
I'm happy to start, Anna.
Well, let's do that. And thank you to everybody who is watching. And thank you, Claire, in particular, because we're here because you've written this book, Beneath the White Coat. And it's a book about mental health. And I should explain to everybody that is watching that apart from my talking to Claire, and Claire's going to read a bit from her book, we've also got a number of other people that are going to contribute, as indeed 3 of them have actually contributed to your book, haven't they? So yes. We've got Richard Duggins, Sandy Miles and Mary Doherty, all of whom have contributed chapters to it. We'll learn more about that later on. And also Adam Kay, who hasn't contributed to the book, but I know you've had a good long chat with him. He can't be with us this evening, unfortunately. But he's coming up in a pre-recorded interview that we've done. And somebody else I want to mention, who I know is very dear to your heart, Claire, is Amrit Sidhu, who is the founder of Doctors in Distress. And as you will now learn, and many of you I know will know this in any event, the profits of this book are going to Doctors in Distress. And it's a charity that's very dear to your heart, Claire. You're the patron of it. But I want to start, apart from also thanking the publishers, Routledge, for their contributions to all of this. I want to talk about, obviously, the book. And I know I'm going to tell people this because I love the fact that Claire always tells me what she really wants me to ask her and what she wants to say. But it can be summed up in this way. Why have you written it?
Well, Anna, I wrote it because for the last decade or so, I've been running a service for doctors and dentists with mental illness. And I just wanted to understand why you've got a profession which outwardly very good prognostic factors, good job, high income, good social network, reasonably intelligent as doctors are, but yet many of them were wanting to hang their stethoscopes up and leave the profession early. And I just wanted to write this book, and the book is actually in different sections. And the first section is I talk about the making of a doctor, and in trying to understand why doctors are becoming so mentally unwell, I took it right back to first principles. And I'm fortunate enough to have one son who studied sociology, another son who studied anthropology, and I was studying group analysis at the time. And the 3 sort of ologies came together and started to help me understand why it is doctors have such a reluctance to seeking help when they're unwell. It is really ingrained, and I'll talk a little bit about myself in a moment. And it's basically, and probably no surprise, it's not just how we're chosen for perfectionism, obsessionality, altruism, but it's also how we're trained. And we're trained in a way to ignore our own vulnerability. We're socialized into the medical community, and the medical community has these unwritten rules that actually say you can't expose yourself. You can't expose yourself in terms of physical health, let alone mental health. I mean, I think things are changing slightly, and I use myself as an example that most of my memorable moments are tied up with medicine, getting into UCH when I was at 18, qualifying as a doctor, my partnership, getting the contract to run sick doctors. But probably my worst example of being unable to show vulnerability was one day when I was knocked off my bike between morning and evening surgery. So I'd left the surgery on my bike and got knocked off just outside the surgery. And so I wheeled my bike back to the surgery, got a taxi to the other surgery, and continued with the evening surgery despite blood dripping from my leg and what amounted to quite a serious fracture. And I often reflected on this. Was a non-stigmatizing illness. Why on earth didn't I say, listen, I'm not well enough to carry on with surgery? And many people listening to this probably will have similar examples of when they're unwell. But so I wanted to understand what it was. It's clearly linked to how we're trained. It's also linked to shame, embarrassment. It's linked to our fear of losing our job if we disclose we've got certain mental illnesses. And in writing the book, it really has helped me to understand, and I hope that people who read the book will help them to lift the bonnet on the madness that is the medical profession.
So who do you want to buy it? Who have you written it for? Is it for your fellow doctors? Is it for people who are thinking of becoming a doctor? Is it people who are running the health service and so on? Who's it for? Who's your audience?
Yeah, thanks very much. The book is written more or less in the first person, except for the chapters that are written by other people, and some excellent chapters, and you'll hear a bit. But the vast majority of the chapters are written by me. They're very, very personal. I disclose more about myself in this book than I have done in any other sphere of life. And I've written it not as a heavy-duty academic textbook, though there are, wherever I've quoted something, I will have referenced it. But I didn't want it to be an inaccessible book for anybody. It's predominantly written for the medical profession and medical students. It's predominantly written for them, but actually it's transferable to any profession, anybody that identifies with their profession. So teachers, nurses, police officers will resonate and will recognize themselves in some of this book. So, and I also have written, some of the chapters are written specifically for doctors, and those here, some of you may understand, but when doctors get into trouble, they don't know what to do. And I've written some chapters at the tail end of the book about how to stay out of trouble, how to stop what, if you are sadly get a complaint against you, what to do about it, and how to minimize the harm for yourself. And finally, it's written for my patients, and some of I've seen it on the participants list. Some of the people, the contributors here, have been patients of mine, doctor patients, and have been generous enough to contribute what it's like to be a patient, a doctor patient. So there's a lovely chapter on how to be a good enough patient from sickness to health. And it is a lovely chapter that is written from those that understand the stigma involved in putting one's hand up and saying, hey, I can't cope, right through to the end. So hopefully people will buy it as an accessible book. It's not difficult language, it's very accessible, and it's written predominantly in the first person, so you'll hear me speak. And later on, I know with Adam and myself, I read some pieces out, so you will hear my voice in this book.
Yeah, but we should make it clear that all the profits, all the proceeds are going to Doctors in Distress.
Yes, and Doctors in Distress, you mentioned Amandip. Amandip set up Doctors in Distress after the suicide of his brother, who was a cardiologist, and I have taken over as the chair of Doctors in Distress, and all profits of this book will be going to that. And we have to remember the Doctors in Distress, because the book, or at least my service for sick doctors, was set up after the suicide of Daksha Emson, who was a young psychiatrist who, before she killed herself, also killed her 3-month-old baby. So whenever I think about doctors, I think about Daksha, and whenever the book is sold, it will contribute to stopping, hopefully forever, the suicide of doctors and other health professions. Though the word doctor is there, it isn't just doctors, it's all health professionals.
Yeah, because if doctors are getting their mental health sorted out, their teams stand a good chance that it will, it's that sort of drip down, isn't it, effect?
Yes, the Doctors in Distress, despite the title, is also for nurses and other healthcare professionals. But actually, it's doctors that have the most problem in accepting their vulnerability. And I am an archetypal, I am probably one of the worst people in accepting my vulnerability. When I even needed to get help after my fracture, it was complications, and I was so frightened of even going and seeking help for my foot that I used a pseudonym. Well, it's a bit of a giveaway when your email is c.rada@nhs. So many of our doctors in my service use pseudonyms, and they forget to alter their email address, which is always the giveaway of their name.
Is this a problem, though? It's obviously a long-standing problem. The mental health issues amongst doctors, the inability to reach out and get all the things you've talked about. Is it something that's actually getting worse, or is it getting something that is getting better? Because I get the sense it's getting worse. That's what concerns a lot of us.
I think you know, funny enough, Anna, I think COVID has changed things, rather like COVID has changed a lot, and good things sometimes come out of plagues. And I have written a chapter on pandemics in this book very late on in the book's publication. And one of the features that's coming out of COVID is the fact that is the mental health of the workforce we have to protect. And if we don't protect them, then there won't be anybody else left to look after us. So just certainly during the first wave, there were lots of services put in for doctors and nurses and other health professionals. So hopefully this will continue as we go forward. If you ask me about stigma and shame, and you'll hear Sandy talking about shame, I think it is getting better. I think the next generation, I think the generation coming up behind us don't have the view that they're invincible and superhuman. I think they have a much healthier attitude towards their physical and their mental health. And I think they're more able to come forward and to not consider themselves as superhuman and actually seek help.
You see, because as a non-doctor, which obviously I am, and it would be foolish to think that this has not been these problems, these stresses have always existed. It's just that in the past, obviously people didn't talk about it, but actually doctors did things to relieve their stresses and their strains. They would drink, basically. They would have other addictions. And now I think that it seems that at least it's a recognition of the problem, and that those old solutions are exactly that, they're for the past.
Yeah, well, there's, again, to plug the book, there's a lovely chapter in the book which is written by was a young medical student called Amy Wilson. She's now become a psychologist, and she's written a book called Mental Illness in Doctors, a Historical Context. And she's looked over the last 100 years at doctors writing about their mental illness. And one of the doctors that's mentioned is a Russian doctor who trained at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, who describes a torrid time that he had. He doesn't talk about mental health because nobody did, but he talks about disillusionment. There's probably the first description of burnout that I've ever seen. So you're absolutely right. It's not something new. But if we think about medical students for 70 years, we've been concerned about medical students' mental health. And yet what we've done is actually made the conditions that we train doctors worse. We've piled on more assessments, we've examined them more, we've made it far more competitive. So whilst this is quite a long-standing issue, it doesn't mean that we've done anything about it. And pre-pandemic, we had a terrible time for doctors. We were in a very bad state of burnout, depression, anxiety, the intensity of the workload, the lack of firms, the lack of teams. So I think whilst it's been around for years, I think now is the time we have to do something about it. I've also tried to unpick whether mental health of doctors is getting worse, and it's very difficult to unpick it because the studies are so bad. On balance, when I've looked at the evidence, I think it is getting worse on balance, and I think it is getting worse amongst medical students, but it's very difficult to compare, for example, in 2020 with 1920. But I think on balance, it is getting worse.
Okay, let me ask you something. I'm playing devil's advocate here. What about those who will say that, in a way, we've gone from one extreme where we didn't talk about mental health, now to the other, where everybody talks about mental health, everybody's got a stress. And to be crude, if you like, in this, the doctor, I'm suffering from stress, is the new doctor, I've got a bad back. And that the danger is that, rather like with our armed forces, where we started talking about PTSD amongst veterans in particular, then there seemed to be the attitude that everybody who'd ever served obviously had a mental health condition. And how do we get the balance so that people don't think, oh, well, if you're a doctor, you're under huge stresses and strains, you've obviously got mental health issues? Because we never seem to get the balance right in this country.
We don't get the balance right. And I'd like to just say there's always this view that doctors today are made of weaker stuff than, for example, my generation. There is no evidence that doctors of today are more or less resilient than myself. It's just we didn't talk about it. We just killed ourselves and drank ourselves to death. Now I think doctors today have a healthier attitude. We also have to understand that the doctor of today is probably one of the most resilient human beings in this country. They can survive very long hours. They can go for long hours without a break, without food, without water. They even have resilient bladders. You know, they can go long hours without visiting the bathroom. And, you know, they are incredibly resilient. But we all have our breaking points, and if the environment in which we work in doesn't support our psychological and physical needs, everybody has their breaking point. Now, in the book, I have a whole chapter on resilience because it's a word that is overused. It's usually used as a word of to blame this generation for falling over. And actually, when you start to unpick resilience, this generation of doctors, as I said, is just as resilient as the last generation. And what happens during doctors training is we develop psychological armor. We have to. And part of that psychological armor is to become detached from our patients, is to be able to leave a resuscitation, a failed resuscitation, and not collapse. And this psychological armor is something that doctors have to learn. My worry is that once we've cluttered up the training of doctors, cluttered up the spaces that they can meet their peers, it's very difficult to develop that psychological armor. So it may be what we're actually finding with this generation is that we have removed the spaces where they actually develop the psychological defenses, the coping mechanisms in order to do the job. But if they're saying, well, I'm stressed, well, listen, everybody is stressed. You only need to say, hello, how are you? The two responses anybody says is, I'm overworked and I'm stressed. I think it's become the sort of a mantra for everybody. Doctors as well, Abigail Zuger, who's a fabulous American doctor who I mentioned in the book, she does mention that maybe doctors are actually, we do moan about things a lot. She doesn't quite say it like that, but we also vocalize our distress in terms of not our mental distress, but sometimes, you know, we may say, listen, the hours are long, the conditions are bad. So it may be that that's what people are picking up. But I think today's generation of doctors are just as able and capable as my generation, if not more.
Well, that's a positive. And Adam Kay is not your generation nor mine.
No.
And you met, you did an interview with Adam, which I think we can now show. I think
yeah, and just to put in context, I worked with Adam's father. So Stuart Kay was a fellow GP in South London. We sort of grew up metaphorically together, and of course I've seen Adam grow up as well. So hopefully we'll see the interview now. See you soon. Hi Adam, thanks so much for coming to my book launch, and you're a pro in this, of course, aren't you? You've published.
No, I'm not. I'm not. I'm only involved in this topic because I jotted my thoughts down, but my experience is no different to any other of the millions of healthcare professionals. But no, I'm really delighted you asked me to come along. We've known each other 30 years, something like that.
30 years, I think, Adam, and I think you're about 30 and a half now, aren't you? So you're a little boy.
Yeah, so Claire's an old friend of my dad, who's a GP who worked locally to her, and so you go back a long way. But I mean, congratulations on the book. It's a hugely important book, I think.
Thank you.
And it does a very clever thing, to my mind, of being sort of scientifically robust and rigorous, and also being accessible to people like me who hate reading scientific papers and fail to read them. It just sort of, I mean, the only thing the huge thing that strikes me is why has it taken until now for this book to appear? It should be something that was read in medical schools for 50 years. But anyway, we've got it now, and hopefully every medical student and every doctor can read it. One particular chapter I wanted to talk to you about was one of the chapters that you wrote about burnout, and you said something that had never occurred to me before, that burnout and depression, I'm paraphrasing, are sort of two sides of the same coin, and people describe themselves as burnt out because they don't want to use the word depressed. And I certainly never described myself as depressed when my job as a doctor was getting on top of me, but I certainly described myself as burnt out.
Yes, yeah, I mean, burnout is a very strange concept, Adam. It was first described about 50 years ago, and as I say in the book, it's a complex issue because it can mean all sorts of things to all sorts of people. And in my own sick doctor service, we have doctors coming with burnout when in fact they're depressed, but they prefer to call themselves burnt out because it seems less stigmatizing. Burnout, if I just sort of look at what I've, burnout, whatever burnout is, it has to include a sort of physical, emotional and mental exhaustion. It has to include all three of them. And I give an example where I ran the London Marathon. Now, I was physically and probably emotionally exhausted at the end of that, but I certainly wasn't burnt out. I was very tired. And so burnout is one of these, really, I think it's overused as a term. And if I just read what I've written, a very brief. Despite thousands of studies, the exact prevalence of burnout is hard to pin down. This is due to the variation in how it's measured, different instruments used and cut-off points for diagnosis, as well as studies using different sampling frames. Perhaps, though, the main reason is because despite attempts over the years to define, measure, study, address and reduce it, burnout is not a disease as such. Rather, it is a dis-ease. A discomfort with oneself and one's place, value and efficacy. It's probably as hard to measure as nostalgia, stoicism, fear, hate or love. We have little idea about the epidemiology or natural history of burnout. Even now, 50 years on from when it was first defined, we cannot answer basic questions such as who gets it, who's more at risk, how much of it is out there, let alone what interventions work in reducing it. Even the impact of burnout is not clearly known. Of course, the cause is known: chronic, unremitting, emotionally stressful jobs. But this doesn't really help in studying it, as one might be able to study the link between smoking and lung cancer. Burnout involves the painful realization that we have failed to make the world a better place, to help the needy, to have a real impact in the organisation, and that all our efforts are for nothing. For me, this feels a much better, more honest and less clinical definition to describe that hopeless feeling when you know, hopefully temporarily, you cannot go on caring for others, and when you realise you cannot make a difference to your patients' lives or to the system you work in. I've had experience of losing interest in the well-being of my patients, becoming bored and worse, of losing my compassion for them. Exhausted from juggling work and 2 young children, I felt an overwhelming desire to resign, to pack it all in and leave medicine completely. It came to a head after a particularly busy and stressful morning surgery. I felt washed out, didn't want to return for the evening clinic, and resented patients having more of my time than my family. Many were my regulars, patients with long-standing intractable problems, and I felt disillusioned. What could I do to help them? I couldn't find them jobs or rehousing. I couldn't repair their broken relationships. I couldn't fix their lives. Medicine had lost its spark. I knew I needed a break from clinical practice. These emotions are so much harder to quantify than the multiple questions in the burnout questionnaires and studies would imply. So that the issues therefore in that chapter, in that brief piece I've written, Adam, is that burnout, the fact that it's so overused, yet we still find it difficult to define. We find it difficult to measure, different sampling frames, let alone what happens with burnout. What does burnout do to the individual? And the passage I describe about my own burnout, what I was fortunate enough to be able to do is to be able to take some time out, literally recharge my psychological batteries, come back in a better place than I left off. Now, whether in fact I was depressed at that point is a moot point. I suspect I was depressed. I had a lot of features. If I was honest to myself, but what actually cured me in essence was getting away from the intensity of the workplace.
And you put a mnemonic at the end of the chapter.
Yes.
And doctors love a mnemonic because
yes.
we're not particularly good at remembering things.
I made this mnemonic up if it's all right. Because listen, I'm not undermining burnout. what I'm commenting on is that burnout is very difficult to hold on to, a little bit like it's difficult to hold on to nostalgia or love. But I've created a short, easy mnemonic to help me remember what I need to do, what I personally need to do. And the mnemonic is actually burnt. B, balance my work and play times. U, understand my limitations. I am not a superhero. R, recognize, prevent and treat burnout in myself and my teams. N, nurture the next generation, bring the fun back into work. And T, teamwork, rest, play and reflect together. And I do end, by the way, Adam, that burnout can be a trigger for change and personal growth. The experience of burnout always involves pain and suffering, but it can then force someone, as it did for me, to examine priorities, to learn and be aware of one's vulnerability. I was lucky. My sympathetic and progressive partnership and opportunities outside the consulting room meant I could take time out, return when ready, and restructure my working life to refresh my psychological self. I mean, people often ask me, how do we survive in medicine? How do we cope with a career in medicine? And I talked about this with Anna, about how we develop coping strategies. Some of these are conscious. So we do team working, we go for mentoring, we might take time out, all sorts of things. We do CPD, but some are unconscious. We develop defense mechanisms that help us. And one of the strongest defense mechanisms is that of denial. I am invincible. This isn't going to hurt me. And in a way, we need some denial, because otherwise we'll crack up every single time you cut into a pregnant lady to do a cesarean, because it's so abnormal to cut into skin, or every time you had to go to a resuscitation or tell somebody that they're dying of cancer. But too much denial makes you hardened, and too much denial can actually make you less empathic with patients. And actually, if you have far too many defense mechanisms, you may actually topple over because you won't be able to do your job properly.
Are we doing medical school right in terms of teaching people what to expect and how to behave when they're doctors?
Are we doing medical school right? No, we're not. We're not at all. I think for about 70 years, and I've got a chapter in the book about medical students, for about 70 years we've been highlighting the problems of medical school and medical student mental health, and we've done precious little. In fact, we've made it worse. We've increased competition. Compared to when I was a medical student, we've made more competition, more exams, more assessments, more rotation, so you never have a peer group. And actually, we've made it worse for them. Yeah, and
something you write very powerfully about in the book is just, I guess, the nature of the job, how it's different to all other jobs, and the consequences of that for the well-being of the staff. So what is it that makes medicine so tough?
Yes, and the chapter I'm going to read sort of describes it, but actually, in a nutshell, it's again quite a complex issue. It's not just the job. Of course, the job is important, but it's not just the long hours, it's not just the unsocial hours, it's not just the examinations we have to do. What I talk about is the emotional work that we have to do, and there are very few jobs where you have to be so attuned and so in contact with others all the day, every day. You can't take your focus away from the patient, because the patient is your first concern. So let me read you this passage. Reasons why doctors are so unhappy are complex. Some contributing factors are associated with the job itself, especially the emotional toil of working close to suffering. Others stem from the common characteristics of those who choose to become doctors. And some are due to wider socio-political factors that relate to the changing place of doctors in society. Others, such as the inability to care for patients in the way one was trained to do, due to the lack of time and the increasing burden of observation and scrutiny, are common problems across the world. But it's not just the unsocial hours or long shifts that make it so difficult, though they add to the stress. Nor is medicine difficult simply due to the vast amount of knowledge we need to remember. After all, lawyers have to learn the equivalent of several telephone directories to do their work well. What makes medicine difficult is having to deal with human suffering and all its attendant emotions. It's not medicine itself that has changed. It's always been difficult. What's changed, Adam, what I think has changed, is how we treat those that deliver the care, how you were treated when you had that crisis, which is in your book, or how even that people listening to this are treated when they've had a tough day. Now, what we ought to be doing is putting a metaphorical arms around everybody, allowing them spaces to talk about their work, giving them a job that doesn't destroy them with the intensity. And oddly enough, Adam, I think COVID has allowed some change in the system. Certainly early on in hospitals, many trusts, especially the larger ones, were giving debriefing to staff. We're putting decompression rooms in. We're even putting in couches or places where people could sleep. We're giving hot food. Can you believe it? Hot food that's not being cooked in the microwave. That we're arranging transport home at the end of a busy shift. So oddly enough, COVID did change how doctors were treated, and nurses to a certain extent. And actually, if we can keep and maintain that, I think we'll go a long way to preventing mental illness in the next generation of doctors.
I don't think until I read your book I realised quite how big a topic it is, and I guess quite what a big ship it is to steer to get from where we are at the moment to where we need to be. But I thoroughly recommend this book to anyone who works in a healthcare setting. It'll make you think a lot about what we're doing wrong and what we need to change and how we can look after ourselves, and just as importantly, how we can look after our colleagues. And I'm really grateful to you for inviting me along.
And Adam, I'm grateful to you, because I think together, and I have to say this together, I think we've worked in parallel. I think you've worked with humour to change hearts and minds of policymakers and politicians. And I hope that I've worked, I mean, I'm humorful, you know, I'm funny, but I've worked with some of the much harder evidence, showing a mirror up to what's happening to the doctors that I manage in my sick doctor service, and the high rate of suicide. And I think this parallel track has actually started to really change the way doctors' mental health is being managed in the workplace. So thank you so much, and good luck with your show tonight.
Thank you very much, and never stop, Claire, never stop.
That was fascinating. That was excellent. Good to see Adam Kay. And more importantly, if I may say, good to hear such a great conversation between him and Claire. So that was...
Apologies for the delay in the whatever...
There was a lot of positivity in that, Claire, wasn't there? Well,
a lot of positivity.
That's what I took away from it.
No, a lot of positivity. And I think Adam, Adam has done a lot to use humour. I won't do a spoiler alert for his book, but you know, he's used humour in his book to highlight the problems of burnout, depression, and the loss of doctors to the profession. So I think very positive, and I want to be positive because I think there is a lot going forward. There's a lot different now than there was when I first started looking after sick doctors a decade ago.
Now there are two things that I haven't done, which I should have done. One is to tell people that we are taking questions. So at the end of what's coming next, and before we go off air, we can take those questions and our little panel can answer them. The other thing is to say that, of course, you can buy this book, and I understand there's a discount and there's a link and all of that malarkey. And if we can, we'll show it during all of this. And if not, we will contact people with those details.
And people want to know if I can do a signed copy. It's difficult. If this was a real book launch, you'd all be in Waterstones, we'd all be sharing wine and alcohol, and I'd be signing copies. I will try my best, but otherwise we will send an email tomorrow to you all. If you can't pick it up on the chat function, then you get a discount, and please do buy it because all the proceeds go towards doctors in distress.
Right, now, Claire, you told us about how a number of people have contributed to the book, and one of them is Sandy Miles, and Sandy talks about the shame, which you were talking about, obviously, but she describes this thing about the shame in medicine of actually, well, it's not just medicine, of course, actually. I know I'm not a barrister, And I know that, you know, this reluctance ever to admit that you burn out under pressure, whatever the euphemisms that were used. And there is the feeling that you are weak, that somehow you're giving in. Anyway, let's listen to Sandy, please. Hi, Sandy.
Hi.
Just tell us in a little nutshell who you are. And I nearly said who you are, what's your name, where are you from, rather like Cilla Black, but you know what I mean.
Hi, I'm Sandy Miles. I'm a GP in Hampshire, and I've written this chapter in Claire's book about shame, and it relates to a kind of interest I have in the medical humanities and how I recognised shame was something that's really not talked about in medicine, but forms an enormous part of our work. So I'm just going to read you a little part of that chapter now.
Please do, thank you.
Experiences of shame are rarely discussed by doctors, yet shame is a powerful, primitive emotion that plays a really important part in the development of identity in one's social values. Shame distorts how doctors perceive themselves, shattering their illusions of competent, strong, trusted doctors. Instead, the self-image becomes someone who is incompetent and hurts patients. The error leads to the doctor blaming themselves, failing in the process to consider the role of others or system factors. They distort their view of themselves as flawed and inadequate. An American doctor and author, William Bynum, experienced a devastating reaction to his serious error he made during an operation. He describes his view of himself. I looked at myself and I was aghast at what I saw. A broken, incompetent, unworthy resident who hurts patients. Before then, others had seen me, and I'd seen myself, as a fairly strong resident, but I clearly had everyone fooled. My true colours and deeply flawed self were now on full display, and a rush of fears came into focus. What would others, particularly those I respected most, think of me? Would they trust me again? Who else would suffer from my incompetence? I plotted ways to leave the hospital completely unseen, and I wondered if I could return. In the days after, I isolated myself, disengaged from the world around me, and suffered quietly. It was brutal. He channeled his feelings into academic research to pull back the curtain on shame. His work highlighted the importance of it as a powerful, debilitating emotion that's often triggered by single events like errors.
Goodness me, thank you for that. I mentioned that I had been a criminal barrister before I got involved in politics, and there's a lot I recognise in that actually, because not so much when you defend, but I remember colleagues who prosecuted really very serious cases, you know, intergenerational sexual abuse cases being classic, when, forgive me, that the evidence is overwhelming, and it tends to be men in the dock. He's been at it for years and he has ruined lives, and despite your best efforts, you get an acquittal. Now, the difference, of course, is that you can't say, as a barrister in those circumstances, I screwed up. You can't put your finger and say, I asked the wrong question. Very rare that, but you still come away thinking, God, I'm rubbish. I'm useless. I failed. Now, in my old profession, we had a rule that you could go to any other barrister's room and speak to them, and you could talk in confidence and you could ask them any question. Do doctors have a problem that you can't do that stuff between yourselves? Is it an admission of failure if you say, you know what, I really screwed up, I think I screwed up, it's all my fault, and all the rest of it?
I think it's probably patchy. So it comes back to Claire's point, I think, about being able to express vulnerability. And I think it's not discussed in medicine enough, this idea of vulnerability. So vulnerability of patients, yes, but vulnerability of doctors, and particularly, I think, helping medical students early in their career make that normal. It's okay. It's important. It's actually more than okay. It's important that they learn those skills, that being vulnerable is not actually being weak. There's a real difference between those two terms. And if you can't express vulnerability, then everyone experiences shame. You can't avoid shame. All you can really do is, when you've experienced it, is recognize it and then talk to somebody about it to help resolve it.
And we know that in recent years, there's been a huge growth in the number of women going into medicine. And without, I hate stereotyping, but women tend to be better at this stuff than men. I think that's fair to say. Has that feminisation of medicine led to an improvement in all the things that you, and obviously Claire in her book, and you as a contributor to that book, are identifying because there are more women involved now becoming doctors?
Maybe, but I think, and this comes from Brené Brown's work, and some of you may have heard of Brené Brown. She's a social work professor in the States, and she has really identified that shame is a very gendered thing. So for men experience shame because they feel weak, whereas for women, they mainly experience shame because they're trying to juggle 25 things. They're looking after children, they're running a household, they're also expected to have an interesting job and maybe do some academic exercise on the side. And they experience shame because they drop some of those balls and they can't juggle it all. So the shame is still there. I think it's just slightly different because the workforce has been feminized. I don't think it's eradicated shame in any way. It's just kind of altered it.
Sally, thank you so much. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
I'm going to speak to Richard Duggins, who's also contributed to the book. I'll be able to see him. There he is. Hi, Richard again. So just quickly tell us who you are, and then please also read an extract from the chapter that you've contributed to the book.
Thank you. So I'm Richard Duggins. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and I work up in Newcastle upon Tyne. And the chapter that I contributed to the book is called The Doctor's Doctor, and it's a really personal chapter about what it's like spending most of my career as a doctor treating other doctors. And the section I'm going to read is from a bit of that chapter called The Importance of Identification. So, during the time I've been caring for sick doctors, perhaps the biggest hurdle I've had to deal with is my natural inclination to over-identify with their suffering, to be overly empathic. Of course, empathy is needed and helps patients feel comfortable. It helps them feel safe enough to open up, and for me to be able to listen to them with compassion, which is the cornerstone of empathy. It's natural that I identify with my doctor patients who, after all, have similar childhood backgrounds, familiar schooling experiences, and of course, common clinical and personal struggles. However, it's easy to overdo, especially as I sit and listen to their stories. I feel the anxiety-provoking realization of there but for the grace of God go I, a sense of survivor guilt. How is it not possible to feel their distress so deeply? Unbridled empathy means I take on their pain, stress, and anxiety. I become angry on their behalf and want to rail against the unfairness of their situation. Taking on their feelings and living through their experience can lead me to feeling hopeless and helpless on their behalf, a form of countertransference as I embody their emotions. I'm going to end there.
Gosh, that's remarkably powerful. So what are doctors like as patients?
Well, they're a privilege to treat as patients. I often think I've got the best job in the world as being a doctor for doctors. But there are challenges. There's a specific and real skill in engaging doctors. And also doctors can be quite high risk patients at times, as Claire's talked about. They're easy, as I've talked about, to over-identify with, to really feel a similarity with, an identification with. And and that can lead you to be tempted to either do too much for them or perhaps not do enough for them, and I think these are risks. A real phrase I like in the kind of the work around treating doctors is compassionate skepticism, which is a word I first heard Claire use. And that's remembering that doctors play things down. So when you're working with doctors, it pays really to be curious and to be brave at times and to ask uncomfortable questions, especially around feelings around hopelessness. And the last thing I'd say about what it's like to work with doctors is it's really, really rewarding, because once a doctor engages in treatment, they do really, really well. So when doctors come through to these services, like the ones, you know, the one that Kate, that's Claire's leading, NHS Practitioner Health, they do remarkably well.
And your advice to any doctor who is thinking about taking that help, no doubt, would be do it.
Yes, it would be stop thinking and pick up the phone and contact us, or write that email, because they're great services, and they make such a difference. So go for it.
Good advice, Richard. Thank you very much. We'll be coming back to you in our panel. We're going to go to Mary. Mary Doherty. I think I pronounced your name incorrectly, Mary. Do forgive me. Is it Doherty or Doherty?
Doherty.
It is Doherty.
Doherty. Yeah.
Tell us quickly who you are, please.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Mary Doherty. I'm an Irish consultant anaesthetist, and I'm founder of peer support network Autistic Doctors International.
Sorry.
I'll read a little from the book.
Could you? Thank you.
I'm an anaesthetist. I'm also autistic. And from as far back as I can remember, I've always felt different, which is an experience common to late diagnosed autistic adults. It wasn't until my son was diagnosed with autism that I realized that I also view the world through the same autistic lens, and that I've had to deal with the same challenges as he has. The greatest difficulty of an undiagnosed autistic adult is not knowing what we're dealing with, not knowing why things seem so difficult, or why other people seem so odd. But now that I understand it, life is so much better, and I love being autistic. Autism is not a mental illness, although autistic people are more likely to develop mental health problems. People are surprised to learn that doctors can be autistic. We don't fit into the neat diagnostic criteria learnt at medical school, or the stereotypes of boys preoccupied with train timetables, or of profoundly disabled individuals requiring full-time care, which many of, believe me, doctors can be. Autistic doctors in almost every specialty I can think of.
When were you diagnosed?
About 7 years ago.
Only 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And how has that affected your, if it has, your work as a doctor, as an anaesthetist?
Knowing makes life so much easier. It was really difficult before. My career was, I certainly took the scenic route in my career. It was not seamless. And looking back, all of the challenges I faced were undoubtedly due to unrecognized autism. So knowing is so much easier. Like, yeah. Do
you get any stigma or prejudice against the fact that just for no other reason than you have the diagnosis and you are autistic?
I guess so. I guess being autistic, it means I don't really care too much about what other people think. So I think I'm probably pretty much immune to that, to be honest. But I see the stigma, and I see the stigma in people who join our group, who haven't been able to come out, who feel, and I mean, for a lot of people, there is a definite career limiting factor to it. People don't understand autism. It's a very misunderstood condition. And for some people, there is a potential risk to their careers, to their lives, by coming out as autistic. I'm hoping we can change that by being more open about it and raising awareness.
Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you for your contribution, not just this evening, but to the book. And actually, I think I don't know what you think, Claire, because obviously you'll know more than I, but I think it must take a great deal of courage for somebody to almost come out as autistic. Is it not within the medical profession?
Well, I've heard Mary speak before, and I have so much respect for Mary. And she's taught me, I mean, she's taught me an enormous amount, because I have to be honest, I didn't think you could be autistic and a doctor till I heard Mary speak about 2 years ago. And she's taught me, and we've actually seen autism quite a bit in the doctors now that we see coming through our service, and we're much more alert to it. And her chapter in the book is a superb chapter that starts to unpick some of the problems, but also, as you've heard, some of the joys. I mean, because Mary, if I'm not speaking out of turn, you talk about being an autistic, somebody with autism dealing in anaesthesia. It's great because you can organise yourself. You're a complete perfectionist. And where do you want somebody to be absolutely rules-based, but in anaesthesia? So, but also, Anna, to the other two contributors, because Richard's, when I first read Richard's chapter, I cried because it was so emotional. And with the chapter on shame, it's rare that we talk about shame, and medicine is full of shaming episodes. And any nurses listening to this, nursing is full of shaming episodes. Shame where you might be shouted at for doing something wrong, shame of making errors. And actually to have those chapters, to have it unpicked in this way, I think is superb. And I've only chosen, because we didn't have time, 3 contributors, but we've got other contributors that have put chapters together. We've got lovely chapters on suffering and stigma. We've got a unique chapter on bipolar disorder. Till I started working with doctors, I never thought doctors could have bipolar disorder and work. And of course they can. I mean, Daksha Emson had bipolar disorder, but to pull it together, we have about 300 doctors with bipolar disorder in my service, so to be able to pull that together. And international medical graduates are such a hard to reach group, and again, looking at those patients. So thank you very much, all of you that contributed, and thank you so much for all the love that you've shown the patients that we've cared for the last decade.
Hear to that. We're going to move on to some questions from people who are watching us. So have you seen these questions?
I'm looking through them. There is a question that...
Oh, right. I thought I might be able to bowl you a googly.
Oh, you can bowl me out. Go on, Anna. And thank you, Anna, for being one of the trustees on Doctors in Distress.
So Giles Croft says, what can we learn from doctors who do thrive, doctors who experience the very same difficult circumstances and yet do not become unwell? What's the hidden variable that explains the difference? Would studying those who thrive unearth it?
And I think you're right, studying those would unearth it. Instinctively, I think what discriminates doctors who survive, not just survive, but thrive, is the supports they have outside the workplace. I think medicine is such a difficult job for what we've talked about, the emotional labour, the physical labour. And I think if you can go home to a space that actually talks, you're allowed to just be and to survive at home, I think discriminates those that maybe do survive and those that fall by the wayside. But very, very few studies have looked at those. I mean, can I be honest? There have been many, many, many studies that look at resilience and resiliogenic factors. And if you took a thesaurus and put in resilience, you'd come up to about 600 words. And every single one of them has been attributed to doctors who've survived. But of course, they're all retrospective. What you have to say is, what is the discriminant that allows two doctors starting out at medical school, one of whom might fall by the wayside and one doesn't? And I'm absolutely convinced it's what you wrap around that doctor outside the working environment.
Yeah, and you see, looking at the wider community, that actually would benefit everybody in whatever circumstances they're in. And I don't think I've ever told you this. My mother was a radiotherapist.
No, you never told me that.
There are 4 or 5 generations of Subarys in the NHS. Well, that's no strong story. But you know, she looked. I remember only on one occasion her coming home from work and saying, "Oh, I've had a bit of it's been a bad day today. One of my patients," and she told me who she described this man. She said, "He died She was, you know, a lot of her patients did. And that was the only time my mother ever talked about work. Strange, isn't it? I can't imagine that situation now.
Can I just mention, because I've seen some people who are on the chat, and I just want to mention Jenny Firth Cousins. And Jenny, I've mentioned you in the book, Jenny, several times, so hopefully you'll buy the book or contributors go to Doctors Invest. Jenny is an extraordinary researcher because she started her research, and she's probably one of the first people to track the mental well-being of medical students and then what were house officers. And she did these studies at exactly the same stage that I was studying. So she did it in second year preclinical. I was second year preclinical at the time, and then first year clinical. And she, I think, has done more as a contribution to changing how we think about mental illness in doctors and medical students than anybody else I can think about. So I'd just like to say, Jenny, thank you so much for joining this webinar. And it's an honour to have you listen to what we're saying. I'm
so sorry, Claire, but I didn't get Jenny's surname.
Firth Cousins. Firth, F-I-R-T-H hyphen C-O-Z-E-N-S. But I just want to say thank you.
Brilliant. Now, I've got an anonymous question. Within medicine, there's an obvious hierarchy. Medical students fall at the bottom. This places them in difficult positions if they find themselves experiencing distress. What options are there that don't compromise how they are perceived, particularly when there is no clear, safe space for anonymous disclosure? Wow, that's a cracking question.
A very cracking question, and it's actually a question that's got so much overlaid and emotional impact on it. I suspect that what this is about is students being able to express their own vulnerability within the workplace and not being able to do it to the people that they should be able to do it, which is their superiors, their tutors and their trainers. So I think, to be honest, I don't think they are the bottom of the pile in the hierarchy. I think actually there are others that probably have a harder time. But I think for medical students, it's important to realise you can get confidential help. You can get confidential help from my service now if you're a clinical medical school student, but you can also get confidential help from your general practitioner.
I have a question from Jenny Holmes, who asks, how do you think COVID-2, that's it, COVID-2.
Yes, it's funny how we're calling it COVID-2.
Yeah, is going to work out. In the northwest of England, doctors already are loudly saying it's going to be catastrophic and feel a lack of care or support from NHS leaders.
Yeah, well, Jenny, I know Jenny very well, and Jenny has done fabulous work helping our doctors. Jenny, I think it's going to be tough. I think it's going to be tough on doctors, nurses. I think we're going into this second wave as more exhausted, less enthusiastic, more demoralised than we did the first wave. And I think there is now a moral imperative for policymakers, for politicians to invest in the mental well-being of staff and actually make sure that we are supported throughout this. Because, as I said right at the start, and with Adam's piece, I'm convinced that if we don't do that, in fact, I'm already seeing the demoralisation. We won't have the staff going forward. So, Anna, can I just also say, I'm sorry to interrupt, hello to all the overseas people that have joined this webinar, in particular my friends from Israel, my friends from Brazil, and my friends from the States. I think we're all in this together. This isn't just a UK NHS issue. I mentioned this in the book. The last 3 chapters about how to survive when things go wrong are very parochial. They are UK based because they talk about the General Medical Council, but everything else uses an international perspective. So what I've written is as translatable to Brazil, to Israel, to America, as it is to the UK. But thank you so much for joining this webinar. It's an honour and a pleasure to see you.
Indeed. And I've got a question. I've asked you quite a few, but one of the things that really troubles me at the moment, just looking at COVID, and I'm not going to get political, but and we've seen it just recently with the President of the United States, and to some extent we saw it with Boris Johnson, was this idea that, of course, if you have any form of illness and you don't shrug it off in 5 minutes, that you are inherently weak. And political, I mean, we've seen it just blatantly with Trump. And it concerns me that all the great work that you and so many others are doing in bashing down the barriers of mental health and all the stuff we've been talking about. But there at the top of politics, we still have this, well, I think it's an outrageous idea that any form of illness is a sign of weakness.
Yes, I mean, you know, without commenting on President Trump, let's comment on President Trump. The idea you can have COVID, one of the most catastrophic illnesses we're seeing of our generation, and he's returning to work within 4 days, is extraordinary. Now, but I have to, let's put things in context. I got COVID. If I didn't know it was COVID, so say I thought it was the flu, I would have returned to work on day 4 of my illness, even though I was probably be still infected with the flu. But because I knew it was COVID, because the flu pandemic told me it was COVID and it was clearly COVID, I didn't return to work, and I actually took the longest period I've ever taken off in my entire career, even with maternity leave. I took off 3 weeks sick leave, and I recovered. I mean, not fully, but I felt really bad taking that time off. So I think there is a sense, like you mentioned, Anna, we always say, how are you? Oh, I'm really stressed, I'm overworked. We naturally fall into this, oh, I'm overworked, as a sort of badge of honor. So maybe if we took some time out, maybe if we actually acknowledged our own, all of us, from politicians, I think the New Zealand Prime Minister is leading the way. So I know there's 2 people with hands up, but before we put the 2 people with hands up, I just wonder if you mind me mentioning something which I've seen on the question and answer, which is about group work. And I would be remiss of me if I didn't mention groups, because as I mentioned, I trained as a group therapist. I never finished the training as an analyst, but this book was driven really by learning about groups, and not to go into groups, but it was learning about what groups do and how we behave in groups. And it was like a light bulb moment, which is where I began to understand why doctors found it so difficult to become to seek help. And what I'm doing with Doctors in Distress is trying to provide groups for all health professionals, doctors in the first instance, so that we can discuss the emotional impact of our work, because I'm an absolutely firm believer that what we've seen over the last decades or so is a lack of spaces for people to talk about the emotional burden of their work. And we expect doctors and nurses to be superhuman. So I'm trying to put in groups, therapy groups, reflective practice groups, narrative-based groups, Ballant groups. Somebody mentioned what a Ballant group. If you haven't heard of what a Ballant group, Google it. They're the best thing that you can ever do. Schwartz rounds, any group that brings you together in a safe, confidential space, facilitated by someone where you can talk about your work. So I just wanted to bring that in if we missed it out, because if I was to fast forward 5 years and say, well, what's changed? What would have changed? Even with the book and the message, what would change is we would have spaces where every single health worker could talk about themselves in the context of their work, as Michael Ballant taught us way back in the 1950s, the doctor, the patient and their illness. And because we've removed the emotional aspects of caring, we've somehow turned it into a biomedical instead of a biopsychosocial. We have assumed that the people that do the caring have no emotions attached to it. So that's really what I would like to see going forward.
Can I ask you, excuse me, I've got a terrible cough now.
All right. I know some good doctors, and I know some very good doctors. Some of them are on this call.
So do I. I do want to ask you about NHS managers and the responsibility in the NHS to take all the things that are in your book.
Okay. Well, I can answer this on several levels. I can say that what we do is we project all the badness into NHS managers as if they can magically make better everything. And I think they can't, because they have the same restraints as we all do. I think what I think your question is coming to is, are managers interfering with the processes of caring? I don't think they are. I think managers, NHS managers, do a fabulous job, all health service managers. I think what interferes with the process of caring is the cluttering up of the ability to have the magical relationship between the patient and the doctor in a consulting room, and anything that clutters that relationship. And by that, I mean the pinging of the computer saying we haven't done a cervical smear, or the time's up for a mammogram, or we haven't in the UK done QOF, which is Quality and Outcome Framework. The pinging of that, or the telephone ringing, or in the States, I know there's a big issue about filling in the electronic medical record, or the billing processes. Anything that clutters that magical space between me and my patient is something that is destroying the ability of doctors and nurses and others to do their work. And managers can help protect that if they're empowered to do that. But I think managers, you see, we all have to find a scapegoat. In this country, in the UK, the scapegoat tends to be the GP. We're seen as both the scapegoat and the saviour. And again, I write about this, but you can see it in the daily paper. In fact, simultaneously, sometimes on the same day, we'll be blamed for being lazy ne'er-do-wells, having our doors closed, and in exactly the same newspaper for the heroic attempts we're doing to open our doors for flu jabs. So I hope that's answered your question. You're on mute, Anna. You're on mute. Anna, you're on mute. That would be the phrase that defines our generation is "you're on mute," and I think it's entered the medical vernacular. Tia, can you you're on mute now.
I thought I'd unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly.
Good. I can't see anybody because I shouldn't really be allowed near a Zoom call because I always get lost in the end and click the wrong button. We're nearly coming to the end of this session. I mean, I know I've learned an awful lot, and there will be many people who are watching this who I know, some will have learned a lot. Actually, I strongly suspect for most you're just confirming what many have experienced and many believe. I mean, you gave me a long list of questions when we talked, rightly so. And I just wanted to make sure that I had actually asked all the questions that you would want me to ask of you, Claire. Is there anything?
You have. You've asked them. I just noticed on the chat function a manager who I won't mention his name, but he'll know, Stephen, who I worked with many moons ago as a junior doctor in South London, and an amazing manager. And when I comment about managers, he's put, and bad ones cause great harm. Yes, of course, bad managers cause great harm, but do you know what? Bad doctors can cause even greater harm. So I think we need to be mindful about creating the scapegoats in the NHS or any healthcare system. And it's been an interesting time. And coming back to the book, Anna, you asked me if there are any questions. No, there are no more questions. I think you've been fabulous. You're a new trustee on Doctors in Distress. The first time we met was when you were a politician and I was head of my profession, and I think we sort of slightly disagreed at the beginning, but since then you've become a firm friend, and I admire what you do so fabulously, and thank you very, very much for chairing this. And I think what we're doing now is have a sort of metaphorical glass of wine, and just people can just reflect and think about their own place in this great world of healthcare and how they manage themselves.
I have to say, well, no, thank you, Claire, and thank you for this book, which of course you have written, but in a way it's also a compilation. And I know that there are some remarkable people, three of whom we've spoken to or heard from this evening, Sandy, Richard and Mary. But thank you to all of them. Now, I apologise for my coughing fit, but I think it was the hour, because I've been drinking very, 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 very sensibly. I've drunk water, but I do have a glass of wine here, which I think might help my throat, and is part of those celebrations that should take place to celebrate the publication of this book, and to remind everybody that the proceeds go to Doctors in Distress.
Thank you. And in the chat function, there was a link to how you can buy the book. But we'll be sending an email in the next day or so to let you know again how to do it. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining this. And I think what we're meant to be doing now is everybody, if we could unblock everybody, I'm not sure we can, but otherwise, wherever you are, put a toast up and let's toast Doctors in Distress and the world and the NHS, and keep safe, everybody, for this next COVID stage. And thank you so much. Well done, everybody.
Well done you, Claire. Thank you.
Well
And congratulations.
Congratulations. And